Hello, friends. Before we jump in to our parable today, if you are hopping on this video, that probably means that you weren't with us last Sunday. So I want to tell you what we talked about as far as our Easter plan. So for this coming Easter, which is April 4th, we're going to have a resurrection hints show and tell. That's right. It's not just a sermon, it is a show and tell Easter. And so that's why I'm telling you about this right now, is so that you can start planning, because everyone gets to bring something and everyone gets to show something, tell something. Of course, if that sets off all kinds of panic alarms in your mind, please know we're not going to force you to talk, or and you certainly don't have to get up at the very front if you do talk. But it just may be that the thing you bring is, or the thing that you're questioning yourself for bringing, it might be the thing that gives someone else hope. So let's talk about how this is going to work. So, what is hope? Hope is a feeling that there's something that you long for, and it's this feeling that it could actually come to be. It could come to pass. So it's this hint of something yet to come, like a child who's in the back seat of their parents' car, and they see a billboard with an ice cream cone on it, and so they say to their mom or their dad, they say, "Hey, do you think that we could stop and get an ice cream cone?" And now the child is paying attention to every turn that the parents make as they navigate, and they know where all of the ice cream joints are. And so, as the parents drive, um, when the parent makes that turn that's headed towards the Dairy Queen, it fills the child with hope. It's a feeling. The child does not have an ice cream cone in their hand, but there's this feeling that something they long for could actually come to be. The parent could have taken another route, but they didn't. Now, of course, with Easter, we are longing for more than ice cream. The resurrection of Jesus whets our appetite for all things to be made new. There are loved ones who we have lost. Are they lost? Our bodies are falling apart, creaking and groaning and all kinds of mess. Relationships that have fallen apart and deteriorated. All of creation is groaning. Inside of ourselves, we long to become who we sense we were made to be. And sometimes we feel like, I'm better than this. And so we live our lives, and as we live our lives, there are these hints that fill us with this feeling. It's resurrection hope. Sometimes these hints are objects, or sometimes they are experiences. Sometimes they are stories, metaphors, things that cause us to feel like this thing we're longing for could actually come to be, that everything could be made new. And those hints, those moments, cause us to feel that same way that that child in the back seat feels when their parent turns towards Dairy Queen, even though they're still waiting to see how this unfolds. That feeling is hope. So for the show and tell, I'm asking you to bring your object, bring your experience, bring your story, your metaphor, whatever it is, the thing that has given you that feeling of resurrection hope. What helps you imagine that it might not only be Jesus who came back to life, but that all things could be made new. So, my request to you is between now and Easter, just be thinking about this, reflecting, thinking, what do I want to bring? What do I want to share? Please don't be bashful. And I know that this starts a second guessing yourself game in your head. And so I want to ask you to, as much as you can, turn that off, because the thing that you question yourself for sharing may very well be the thing that fills someone else with hope. So that's our Easter plan. All right. So now, today, here's our parable. So get a drink. One day, people were crowding around Jesus, thousands of them. They're pushing and shoving and trampling one another, trying to get close enough to Jesus just to talk to him and touch him. Kind of like a group of reporters, all clamoring with their questions to be answered. And among the group, one man's request really rang through the noise. He said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, it wasn't anything new to ask a Jewish rabbi to give a legal ruling. That's what this guy's asking for. It's, Jesus, here's a cry for justice, a cry for a legal ruling. The situation is that, okay, so when a father dies in that day, if they didn't leave a will, no oral will, no written will, oftentimes the entire inheritance, so the whole farm, the whole estate, whatever we're talking about, went completely to the oldest brother. Now, normally, the oldest brother still gets a double portion. Like if dad wrote a will, the oldest brother is going to get a double portion of the inheritance because he's the oldest. But if dad didn't leave a will, then chances were good that the oldest brother gets the whole farm, so to speak. And that was just the way the law of the times worked. The younger brother or brothers didn't get any of it unless the oldest brother agreed. Okay, fine, I'll divide it with you. Otherwise, it all belonged to the oldest brother. He had all the power. And so here's a younger brother, and he's saying, "Come on, Jesus, this is an opportunity to set the injustice of the inheritance system straight." And Jesus replies to this fellow. He says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between you?" Well, that really set the guy back on his heels. That sets me back on my heels. Like, Jesus, don't you care about the injustice of the inheritance system? Don't you care that this younger brother doesn't have an inheritance? I mean, this might be completely messing up his plans and his how's he going to earn a living, an income? Well, Jesus was a master of symptoms and illnesses. And in this particular situation, Jesus saw something that was behind the cry for justice, something else that needed healing. Jesus saw a broken relationship between two brothers. The relationship between the younger brother and the older brother was obviously already on the rocks, already deteriorating, because if you are resorting to asking a rabbi for a legal ruling, the relationship is already falling apart. Like, if you've ever lived this, or if you know anyone who's lived this, you get it. As the estate is being divided, when people start calling lawyers, that means the relationship ain't working. When they're like, "Well, I'm going to take this to court," that means the conversations didn't work. The communication didn't fix it. The relationship isn't working. And the younger brother wasn't asking Jesus, "Hey Jesus, can you help me with my relationship? There's this rift between my older brother and I, and can you help us reconcile?" That's not the request. Somehow the what's important has become the money, the wealth. That's become more important than the relationship. And so he's saying, Jesus, tell my older brother what to do. Now, even if Jesus did answer this plea for justice, in this case, it's not going to restore that broken relationship because there's something else coming between the brothers, and Jesus identifies it. What's coming between the brothers is greed. And so Jesus turns to the crowd, not just to this fellow, but to everyone, and he says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. So that word he uses, it's this insatiable appetite for more, more, more. It's I want to exceed you. I want to outdo you. And it always involves the exploitation of others. It just does. And so Jesus says, he tells everyone, he says, life does not consist of an abundance, of a surplus of possessions. It just doesn't. And so then Jesus goes on to tell a story. He says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So this rich man has such a bumper crop, he has so much surplus that he doesn't have a place to store it all. What's he going to do with all this grain? And so this farmer, this rich man, he starts talking and planning and discussing with himself. And he says to himself, he says, okay, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I'll store my grain, my surplus grain. That's where I'll put my goods, my things. And then I'll say to myself, or I'll say to my soul, self, talking to himself, self, soul, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. So take it easy. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Now, what could be wrong with that? I mean, isn't that what we all want? Take life easy. Eat, drink, be merry. You know, there was a time when it was fashionable to, maybe it still is, to have these signs on your wall that say, live, laugh, love, or these different slogans. And plenty of them said something like, basically, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. It reminds me of a Christmas card, like, be merry. Sounds like the American dream. And as we look at this guy, like, we just call this good business practice. Like his rich farmer in the story is kind of the poster boy for business savvy. Sounds like a hero. Sounds like someone to emulate. Like in 2021, if someone is tearing down their barns to build bigger barns, they're considered a shrewd entrepreneur, successful, enterprising, and they have our respect because they must know what they're doing. They must be good at some kind of resource management. They must understand the market. And so everyone wants to know their secret. They're like, wait, how did you make that work? How'd you pull that off? So this guy, this rich guy, he must know how to maximize a profit. Like if you have a surplus of grain and right now the price is only okay, yeah, it only makes sense to store it until there's a shortage of grain, and then the price is driven up, and then sell your grain. Like farmers do that all the time right now. And so yeah, buddy, if you need bigger barns to store your grain while you wait for the price to be driven up, build the barns, buddy. Like more power to you. Keep biggering and biggering. That's how the story sounds to us. But to an audience of Galilean peasants, this rich farmer would have appeared very different. To Jesus' audience, a rich guy like this would not have been a hero. They would hear this story and they would immediately understand this rich guy is a crook. So it was only the top 1% of the population in ancient Palestine who were really the wealthy landowners, like this guy in Jesus' story. That's Craig Keener, that's Herzog, that's Linsky. There's numerous people who have done a lot of work on this. It was the elites who were making life difficult for everyone else. And specifically, this guy, this rich guy, he's hoarding grain. So here's the difference between our world and Jesus' world. So what's your picture of a hoarder? What does your picture of a hoarder look like? Picture them in your mind. Are they wearing pajamas? Are they wearing a muumuu? The rooms of their house are filled, floor to ceiling, with old things. You got boxes and old newspaper clippings and broken blenders and lampshades and trinkets, and just filled with things that nobody else really wants or needs. And it's highly unlikely that this person, this hoarder, holds a position of power in the community. Rather, the community views a hoarder with either sympathy, they feel sorry for them, or with disdain. They look down on them. And we really don't think of a hoarder as a thief. We don't think, wow, you're stealing from everyone. We just think, wow, you're filling your house with things. Rather, in our world, someone like this might be diagnosed with a mental health condition. There's, the DSM actually has hoarding disorder. Okay, so that's our world. In the first century, in Jesus' day, hoarding surplus was always considered stealing. It was always considered exploitation. See, ancient Galilee was a world of limited goods. Actually, most of history was a world of limited goods. So if a rich man took this huge slice of the pie, like he's hoarding the grain, it automatically meant that other people were getting a much smaller slice of the pie, or no pie, like no grain. It's a world of limited goods. The pie is only so big. There was no such thing as making the pie bigger. So someone's just going to go without food in this case if he's hoarding grain. To call someone rich in Jesus' day, it wasn't just a statement about how much money they had. It was a statement about their morality as well. Because it meant if they're rich, it meant that they had the power to take something from the weak, something that rightfully belonged to the weak. If you were poor, it meant you can't defend from that. You can't defend what should be rightfully yours. And so hoarding surplus is always considered stealing. And the sin wasn't how you earned the surplus. The sin was that you were hoarding it. You say, are you sure about that? That sounds kind of hokey. Okay, well, church history is ripe with leaders who addressed hoarding. So Basil of Caesarea writes, are you not a robber, you who consider your own that which has been given you solely to distribute to others? This bread which you've set aside is the bread of the hungry. This garment that you've locked away is the clothing of the naked. Those shoes which you let rot are the shoes of him who is barefoot. Those riches that you've hoarded are the riches of the poor. Jerome writes, Every rich person is either unjust or the heir of an unjust person. Ambrose says, the things that we cannot take with us are not ours. Compassion alone follows us. Augustine says he's talking about the rich man, the rich farmer in this parable. He says he didn't realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than his own barns. James, the half brother of Jesus, this is scripture right here. He writes, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted. The moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. So, convinced yet? The history of the world is mostly a history of limited goods. And it's not until the Industrial Revolution, like 1760s to 1840-ish, that all changed. Factory production. So now the economic system, it was finally able to start producing more goods than people knew how to consume. And so brought on the advertisement industry. Now the advertisers have to train the people that, hey, you actually want and need things that you don't think you want and need. They had to create consumers. Before that, it was a world of limited goods. So there's this disconnect here. Like when you and I walk through the store, if we grab a surplus loaf of bread, and we throw it in our shopping cart, and we're going to go home with a surplus loaf of bread, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone else in this world isn't going to get a loaf of bread. It might mean it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it, because there's a lot of bread. It just means you have an extra loaf of bread. But for centuries, it wasn't that way. It was, if you're hoarding, someone else is going without, period. So not only is this rich guy in Jesus' story hoarding grain, he's talking to himself. And that's a big deal. See, he's making all of his decisions alone. He's talking to his self, his soul is what it's called in the story. Now, everyone knew in Jesus' day that even trivial decisions you discuss. You have these conversations, sometimes long conversations with your family, your friends, your village, your community. You talk it out because my business is your business and your business is my business and vice versa. We go around and around. And so we talk it out. But this guy, he's isolating himself. He's only talking to himself. Now, someone this wealthy, it's not just because he lives alone, because someone this wealthy was bound to have a family and a network of people in his life. But with this guy, he's just not sharing that relationship with anyone else in his life. The prophet Isaiah, he writes, he says, woe to you who add house to house and join field to field until no space is left, and you live alone in the land. That's this guy. Greed leads to this breakdown of relationships. It leads to isolation. And so he should be talking with his whole village. Hey, I got this bumper crop. I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? He's just talking to himself. The wealthier, the greedier we become, the farther we withdraw from everyone else, and isolation, no real love. So This guy thinks he has it made. You know, oh, I'll take life easy. I'll eat, drink, be merry, you know? But the rest of Jesus' story, he says, actually, God came to this guy on this very night. And God says to him, you fool. He says, this very night, your soul, yourself, that's who he's been talking to, your soul, yourself, they will demand from you. And then who's going to get what you've prepared for yourself? You say, who's they? Like, who's demanding this rich man's self or this rich man's soul? It sounds like he's going to die. So there's some fancy Greek footwork here with the word demand, apaitusin. So it's conjugated as the word they. They will demand. You could read it as so they is God. If you want to have God talking about God's self in the third person as a they, and if you want to have God killing the rich man, um, you could read it that way. That's not the way I read it. And if you were reading it as God kills the rich man in this parable, then there's this interesting question like, okay, so we've got the 8 richest men in the world right now have more wealth than the the poorest half of the world. So you got 8 guys who have more money than 3.9 billion people combined. These 8 guys. Why isn't God killing them? If this is the parable, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, a few others, like what? It's interesting. Okay, so there's another way to read it. In my opinion, it makes a lot more sense. That God comes and says, they are going to require your self, your soul. Well, who's they? It's all the people who got left out of the conversation about what should happen with the surplus grain. They are the people whose slice of the pie just got taken away. So this conversation about what happens with the surplus grain, it was supposed to happen with they, the village, the family, the community. It wasn't supposed to happen with the self. But the rich guy, he makes this unilateral decision. I'm going to cut everyone out of the conversation. I'm only going to talk to myself. So they demand the self. They demand the soul of this man. And in this case, it depicts like a peasant uprising, which the history of the time documents, yeah, that kind of violence happened. So there's this breakdown of relationship that occurs with the rest of the peasants in the village and disintegrates into violence. They would rather attack the rich man than starve to death. We won't let you exploit us like this. And so in the parable, God says, who's going to get all your stuff? Who's going to get all your wealth, all of your surplus? And so that's the parable Jesus tells. And he wraps it up by saying, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Now, I wonder, how did this younger brother who heard this parable, how did he receive it? How did it sound to him? How did it feel to him? Did it feel like empathy? Did it feel like Jesus was saying, look, dude, your brother is on a greedy path, and that greedy path doesn't end well. It ends in a breakdown of relationship, not only with you two, but with this world. And I'm sorry. Or was Jesus planting seeds of transformation, like a different way of looking at the situation? Was this a wake-up call? Did this bring the realization to the younger brother, oh, there's there's relational work to be done here. I've allowed myself to start caring more about the money than the relationship. Jesus didn't answer the original request. He says, give me a legal ruling. Doesn't answer it. Tell my brother what to do. But he does offer a diagnosis of the illness. It's, look, the path that you two are on as brothers, it's not taking you anywhere good. This is how it will be. The soul, the self, defeating nature of greed really does destroy relationships, and it causes suffering and isolation and causes relationships to be reduced to legal rulings or violence. And Jesus is saying this is how it will be for people who store up for themselves things, but they aren't rich towards God. So this soul sickness of greed, it really is an epidemic in our world today. And it begs the question, how can we be free of this? Like, how can we be free of this black hole of self that greed creates? So just the suck of me, my, mine. And how can we be free of this compulsion for more, 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 this insatiable appetite that causes us to work harder and harder for less and less return? How can we be free from the conversations we have in our own heads, talking to ourselves, telling ourselves things, and we don't run them by anyone else? We just get into this internal cycle, self-isolation. How can we be free of the way that greed breeds self-reliance? And then we're pushing others away. Like, I don't want to trust what they have to say. I don't want to need those people. And we end up alone in the land. How can we be free of the vicious cycle where we're trying to control tomorrow by hoarding things today? And it's all worry. It's okay, I need wealth so that I can feel secure. But then the more wealth we gain, the more stuff we have. Now we're worrying about losing it, or we're just thinking about what we don't have. We're thinking about our lack. How can we be free from the bigger problems that bigger barns create? We say, oh, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger barns. I'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we just have bigger problems. How can we be free of this cycle of unilateral decisions where those who are affected really don't have any say, and the relationships break down and people just resort to legal rulings or to violence, various forms of violence, and they just drive one another farther and farther away with polarization? And how can we be free of the way that relationships are disintegrating right now because people disagree about politics? Like this, there's this parallel in this parable where, who gets the money and whose slice of the pie was just made smaller or bigger, and who's suffering and who's hoarding and who's making the unilateral decisions and who's attempting the legal rulings and who's resorting to violence. And how can we be free of the certainty where people say to Jesus, they say, well, I know I have the right answer, so I know Jesus should side with me because I'm on the side of justice. So tell my brother to divide the inheritance. And underneath it all, that's just all surface level symptoms. Underneath it, greed is just tearing relationships apart. Money's more important than relationships. Jesus has more to say about money than prayer in the Gospels. And it's almost like Jesus understands us, understands the things that consume our thoughts and our motivations and our prayers. And so Jesus teaches this way that's both horizontal and vertical. Love God and love neighbor. And when we do it well, not only are we free from greed, but then we have this capacity as a community to paint a picture of what could be. paint a picture of what does it look like to live free from this stuff. And it has been done in bits and pieces throughout history. The pagan emperor, Julian the Apostate, guy who really wanted to stamp Christianity out, he actually couldn't deny the freedom from greed that he was witnessing. And he wrote about, he called them the godless Galileans. He's writing about the Christians. He said, these godless Galileans, Christians, he said, they feed not only their poor, but they feed our poor also. He says, those who belong to us, the Roman Empire, he says, they look in vain for help that we should render to them. It's things like that. The book of Acts saying there were no needy among them, that really get your imagination going. What if that same kind of relationship, what if that same kind of love consumed us? So I close today with the way Jesus wrapped this parable up. Because he doesn't just tell the parable and then like, okay, I'm done talking. He tells the parable and then he has a few more things to say. He says, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you'll wear. For life is more than food. The body is more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn. Yet God feeds them. Barn. I love it. How much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They don't labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you? You have little faith. And don't set your heart on what you'll eat or drink. Don't worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, but your heavenly Father knows what you need. Seek first his kingdom. These things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. It's a verse that we try to wipe away. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So may we be rich towards God. May we be rich in love. May we be rich in relationship. And may these seeds of transformation that Jesus is planting, may they continue to grow in my heart and in your heart. Love you, friends.